when 24-year-old architect Ananya Rao from Bangalore posted her last Instagram update from Cairo on January 12th, a smiling selfie in front of the pyramids with the caption, "Finally living my dream. Egypt is magical." She had no idea this would be the last post her family and friends would ever see from her. 3 months later, her name would appear in international headlines, and her story would force millions of solo travelers worldwide to reconsider their own dreams of adventure and freedom. Ananya Rao was the youngest child of a successful middle-class family in Bangalore. Her father, Rajesh Rao, was a respected software engineer at Infosys who had worked his way up from humble beginnings. Her mother, Kavitha Rao, was a college professor of English literature who had instilled in Ananya a deep love for storytelling and exploration. Growing up in a household that valued education and cultural curiosity, Ananya had always been encouraged to pursue her dreams, no matter how ambitious they seemed. From childhood, Ananya had been fascinated by ancient civilizations and architectural marvels. Her bedroom walls were covered with photographs of the Taj Mahal, Angkor Wat, and the pyramids of Giza. She would spend hours studying these structures, sketching their designs, and dreaming of the day she could see them in person. After graduating with honors from the prestigious Sir M. Visvesvaraya Institute of Technology with a degree in architecture, she landed a promising position at a boutique architectural firm in Bangalore, specializing in sustainable urban design. But despite her professional success, Ananya felt constrained by the expectations of Indian society regarding young, unmarried women. Her parents constantly worried about her safety and frequently suggested it was time for her to consider marriage. "You're 24 now, Beta," her mother would say. "Maybe it's time to think about settling down. Traveling can wait until after marriage." This pressure only intensified Ananya's desire to prove her independence. She had been saving money for 2 years, meticulously planning a solo trip to Egypt that would demonstrate she was capable of navigating the world on her own terms. Omar El Sayed was 29 years old and had been working in Cairo's tourism industry for nearly a decade. To visitors, he appeared to be the perfect tour guide, knowledgeable about Egypt's rich history, fluent in multiple languages, including English and Hindi. He was tall and lean, with dark hair, expressive brown eyes, and a charming smile that seemed to put nervous travelers at ease immediately. His social media profiles were filled with glowing reviews from satisfied customers and testimonials praising his expertise. But Omar's carefully constructed public persona was a masterful deception. His real name was Omar Hassan, and he had been arrested multiple times for fraud and harassment of female tourists. However, corruption within the local police force and his ability to change identities had allowed him to continue operating with relative impunity. Over the years, Omar had perfected a system for targeting young women traveling alone, particularly those from affluent backgrounds who seemed naive about the realities of solo travel in Egypt. Ananya's obsession with Egypt had begun during her final year of architecture school, when she wrote her thesis on sacred geometry in ancient Egyptian architecture. The research had consumed her for months, involving detailed mathematical calculations and architectural drawings that demonstrated how the ancient Egyptians had encoded sophisticated relationships into their monumental structures. Her thesis advisor had been impressed by her work's depth and originality. "This research deserves to be published," he had told her. "You should consider pursuing this further, perhaps even traveling to Egypt to study these structures firsthand." That suggestion had planted a seed that grew into an obsession. Ananya began following Egyptian archaeology accounts on social media, joining online forums dedicated to ancient architecture, and connecting with other travelers who had visited Egypt. She meticulously researched every aspect of her planned trip, the best times to visit different sites, safety precautions for solo female travelers, and budget-friendly accommodations. Her Instagram account, at Ananya Architecture, had gained a modest but engaged following of fellow architecture enthusiasts and travel lovers. She regularly posted about her research, her architectural projects in Bangalore, and her dreams of visiting Egypt. Her posts were thoughtful and educational, often explaining the historical significance of architectural features or sharing interesting facts about ancient building techniques. It was through one of these posts that Omar first discovered her. Ananya had shared a detailed analysis of pyramid construction techniques, accompanied by her own technical drawings. Omar, who monitored various hashtags related to Egypt and tourism, immediately recognized her as a potential target. She was young, educated, traveling alone, and clearly passionate about Egyptian culture, exactly the type of victim he preferred. Omar began subtly engaging with her content, leaving knowledgeable comments that demonstrated his apparent expertise in Egyptian history and architecture. He didn't immediately reveal his profession as a tour guide, instead positioning himself as a fellow enthusiast of ancient Egyptian culture who happened to live in Cairo. "Your analysis of the pyramids' mathematical relationships is fascinating," he commented on one of her posts. "As someone who lives in the shadow of these monuments, I'm always amazed by how much foreigners can teach us about our own heritage." Ananya was thrilled to receive such engaged and knowledgeable feedback. Most comments on her posts were simple expressions of admiration, but Omar's responses demonstrated genuine understanding of her research and offered new perspectives she hadn't considered. She began looking forward to his comments and started checking his profile to learn more about this mysterious Egyptian architecture enthusiast. Omar's profile was carefully crafted to appeal to someone like Ananya. It featured photos of him at various archaeological sites, always dressed professionally, and often accompanied by what appeared to be educational groups. His bio described him as a cultural heritage advocate based in Cairo. There were no obvious indicators that he worked in tourism, and certainly no hint of his criminal background. Over several weeks, their online interactions gradually became more personal. Omar began sending private messages, initially to share articles that he thought might interest her, but eventually to ask about her work and travel plans. "I can see from your posts that you're planning to visit Egypt," he wrote. "That's wonderful. I'd be happy to share some recommendations for places that most tourists never see, sites that would be particularly interesting from an architectural perspective." Ananya was excited to have found what seemed like a local contact who shared her interests and could provide insider knowledge. She told him about her planned January trip, her budget constraints, and her desire to see not just the famous tourist sites but also lesser-known architectural treasures. Omar responded with enthusiasm and helpful information, providing detailed recommendations for budget accommodations and suggesting the best times to visit popular sites to avoid crowds. "Most tour companies take visitors to the same handful of sites," he wrote, "but Egypt has so much more to offer someone with your level of knowledge. There are architectural sites that aren't on any tourist map, local artisans who still use traditional building techniques, and researchers doing cutting-edge work on ancient construction methods. I'd be honored to help you connect with some of these resources during your visit." This was exactly what Ananya had hoped for: access to experiences that would set her trip apart from ordinary tourism. Omar seemed like a kindred spirit, someone who understood her passion for architecture and her desire for meaningful cultural exchange. She began to think of him as her first real friend in Egypt, even though they had never met in person. If you've ever dreamed of solo travel or felt the pull of distant places calling your name, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore the darkest truths behind wanderlust and show you how predators target travelers who just wanted to see the world. Ananya's story will change how you think about trust, safety, and the real price of adventure. Ananya's departure from Bangalore was an emotional experience that perfectly captured the conflicted feelings surrounding her journey. Her parents had spent weeks oscillating between pride in their daughter's independence and terror about her safety. The night before her flight, her mother had stayed up late, making sure Ananya's suitcase was perfectly packed, while simultaneously trying to convince her to reconsider the trip entirely. "Beta, I know you're intelligent and capable," Kavitha had said with tears in her eyes. "But Egypt is so far away, and you'll be completely alone. What if something happens?" Rajesh had been more supportive, though his concern was equally evident. "Your mother and I are proud of you for pursuing your dreams," he had told Ananya. "We just want you to promise us that you'll be careful. Trust your instincts, and don't hesitate to come home if anything feels wrong." The flight from Bangalore to Cairo, with a connection in Dubai, gave Ananya plenty of time to reflect on the magnitude of what she was undertaking. As she watched India disappear beneath the clouds, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that seemed to intensify with every mile. During the layover in Dubai, she posted her first travel update on Instagram, a photo of herself in the airport with the caption, "First stop on my Egyptian adventure. Can't believe this is actually happening." Among the many supportive comments was an encouraging message from Omar. "Welcome to the Middle East. Cairo is waiting for you. Safe travels," and don't hesitate to reach out when you arrive if you need any assistance settling in. When Ananya's plane finally descended into Cairo International Airport, she was struck by her first glimpse of the city sprawling endlessly under the desert. Sunday, the landscape was unlike anything she had ever seen. A vast urban expanse where modern buildings stood alongside ancient minarets, where traditional markets existed blocks away from gleaming shopping centers. The airport itself was overwhelming in its chaos and energy. Unlike the orderly efficiency of Bangalore's airport, Cairo's terminal was filled with a constant din of voices speaking Arabic, English, French, and dozens of other languages. Getting through customs and immigration was her first real test of independence. The officials were polite but thorough, asking detailed questions about her travel plans and accommodation arrangements. Her accommodation was a modest but clean guest house in the Zamalek district that Omar had recommended. The area was popular with foreign visitors and had a relatively cosmopolitan atmosphere. The guest house owner, a middle-aged woman named Fatma, spoke excellent English and immediately took Ananya under her wing. "First time in Egypt?" Fatma asked, as she showed Ananya to her room. When Ananya nodded, Fatma smiled warmly. "You picked a good neighborhood. Zamalek is safe for young women, and there are many interesting things to see within walking distance. Just remember to dress conservatively when you venture out, and always trust your instincts about people." That first evening, as Ananya sat on her small balcony watching the sun set over the Nile, she felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had successfully navigated her first day in a foreign country, entirely on her own. She posted another Instagram update, a photo of the Nile at sunset with the caption, "Day 1 in Cairo complete. This city is incredible, ancient and modern existing side by side. Tomorrow I start exploring." Among the supportive comments was another message from Omar. "Beautiful photo. I hope your first day went smoothly. The real adventure begins tomorrow. There's so much to show you that you won't find in any guidebook." Ananya's first few days in Cairo were a whirlwind of solo exploration that both thrilled and challenged her. She visited the Egyptian Museum, where she spent hours studying artifacts she had only seen in textbooks. The experience of seeing the actual gold mask of Tutankhamun and intricate hieroglyphics carved into ancient stone tablets was overwhelming in the best possible way. Each evening, she would return to her guest house, exhausted but exhilarated, spending hours writing detailed blog posts and uploading carefully curated photos to Instagram. Her posts were receiving more engagement than ever before, with followers commenting on her detailed explanations of architectural features and historical contexts. Omar had been following her posts closely, liking and commenting on each one, with increasingly personal and encouraging messages. "Your insights about the construction techniques are brilliant," he wrote under one post. "I can see why your thesis advisor encouraged you to pursue this research further. Have you considered visiting some of the lesser-known sites where you can see these techniques still being used by traditional craftsmen?" By her fourth day in Cairo, Omar suggested they meet in person. "I know we've only communicated online," he wrote in a private message, "but I feel like we've developed a real connection through our shared passion for Egyptian architecture. I'd love to take you to some sites that most tourists never see. Would you be interested in meeting for coffee first, somewhere public where you'll feel safe?" Ananya was initially hesitant about meeting someone she had only known online, but Omar's approach was reassuring. He suggested they meet at Café Riche, a famous Cairo establishment frequented by intellectuals and artists during daylight hours. "I completely understand your caution," he wrote when she expressed uncertainty. "Meeting strangers in foreign countries requires careful consideration. We could start with a brief coffee meeting, and if you're comfortable after that, we could discuss visiting some architectural sites together." The choice of venue impressed Ananya. Café Riche was indeed a famous Cairo institution, a historic coffee house that had been frequented by renowned writers and politicians for decades. Omar's knowledge of such places seemed to confirm his authenticity as a cultural enthusiast. On the appointed day, Ananya dressed conservatively, but professionally, and arrived at Café Riche a few minutes early, choosing a table with a clear view of the entrance. Omar arrived precisely on time, and she recognized him immediately from his social media photos. He was tall and lean, dressed in a crisp white shirt that gave him a professional appearance. His smile was warm and genuine as he approached her table. "Ananya, "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you in person," he said in excellent English with only a slight accent. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I hope you've been enjoying your time in Cairo so far." The conversation flowed naturally from the moment Omar sat down. He was exactly as knowledgeable and passionate about Egyptian architecture as his online presence had suggested. He asked thoughtful questions about her thesis research, offered insights into aspects of pyramid construction that she hadn't considered, and demonstrated a deep understanding of both ancient building techniques and modern archaeological methods. "Your thesis about the mathematical relationships in pyramid design touches on something I've been researching as well," Omar told her, pulling out a notebook filled with detailed sketches. "I've been working with a local archaeologist to document traditional measurement systems that modern builders still use in certain parts of Egypt." Ananya was fascinated by Omar's notebook, which contained hand-drawn diagrams that complemented her own research in unexpected ways. When she commented on his practical understanding, Omar explained that he had grown up around traditional builders and had learned many techniques through hands-on observation. "Academic knowledge is essential," he said, "but there's something to be said for learning from artisans who carry on traditions that their grandfathers used. I'd love to introduce you to some of these craftsmen, if you're interested. They work on restoration projects where you can see ancient techniques in action." This was exactly the kind of authentic cultural experience Ananya had hoped to find. Omar wasn't just offering to take her to tourist sites. He was promising access to living traditions that connected directly to her academic interests. As their coffee meeting extended into the afternoon, Ananya found herself increasingly impressed by Omar's knowledge, his respectful manner, and his apparent genuine interest in facilitating her research. He spoke knowledgeably about Egyptian history, contemporary politics, and cultural traditions. "I should mention," Omar said near the end of their meeting, "that I do occasionally work as a cultural guide for visitors who are interested in more than typical tourist experiences. But I want to be clear that I'm not trying to sell you anything. I suggested this meeting because I genuinely enjoyed our online conversations and thought we might be able to help each other." His transparency about his work as a guide actually increased Ananya's trust in him. Rather than hiding his profession, he was being honest about his background while emphasizing that their interaction was based on mutual intellectual interest. Before parting, Omar suggested they continue their conversation in a few days, perhaps visiting sites where traditional building methods were still in use. "There's a restoration project at a medieval mosque where craftsmen are using techniques that haven't changed since the 14th century, he explained. "Both would be fascinating from your architectural perspective." Ananya agreed enthusiastically to continue their collaboration. Omar seemed like exactly the kind of local contact she had hoped to find, someone who could provide access to authentic cultural experiences while respecting her interests and independence. Over the next 10 days, Omar proved to be everything he had promised and more. He introduced Ananya to traditional craftsmen, working on restoration projects at some of Cairo's most significant historical sites. She was able to observe and document building techniques that dated back centuries, taking detailed photographs and notes that she knew would be invaluable for her future research. Omar's knowledge extended far beyond what any typical tour guide would possess. He could explain the historical context of different architectural periods, the cultural significance of various decorative elements, and the mathematical principles underlying traditional design systems. More importantly, he treated Ananya as an intellectual equal, asking for her insights and incorporating her observations into their discussions. "Your background in modern architecture gives you a unique perspective on these traditional methods," Omar told her one afternoon as they watched master craftsmen carving geometric patterns into stone columns. "You can see structural relationships that those of us who learn these techniques informally might miss." The sites Omar chose were carefully selected to build trust while gradually isolating her from other tourists. He began with popular locations where other visitors were present, then progressively moved to more remote sites where they were often alone with local workers who spoke little English. Each transition felt natural and was justified by legitimate educational value. During these excursions, Omar began sharing more personal information about his background, crafting a narrative that would appeal to Ananya's values. He told her about growing up in a poor family where education was not prioritized, but where he had been fascinated by the ancient buildings surrounding him in Cairo. He described teaching himself about architecture through observation and conversations with elderly craftsmen. My family never understood why I was so interested in old buildings when I could have been earning money in more practical ways, Omar confided, but I always felt that preserving our cultural heritage was more important than personal profit. Meeting someone like you, who shares this passion and can bring academic credibility to this work, feels like a validation of everything I've been trying to accomplish. This backstory created emotional resonance with Ananya's own struggles for independence and academic recognition. Omar positioned himself as someone who, like her, had to fight against family expectations to pursue intellectual interests. The parallel between their stories created a sense of kinship that deepened Ananya's trust in him. Omar also demonstrated remarkable cultural sensitivity in his interactions with Ananya. He was always respectful of her comfort level, never pushing her to visit places that made her uncomfortable. He showed understanding of the challenges faced by young Indian women traveling alone and offered practical advice about navigating Egyptian culture safely. "I want you to feel completely secure during your time here," Omar told her one evening. "If you ever feel uncomfortable with any situation I suggest, please tell me immediately. Your safety and comfort are far more important than any research opportunity." This apparent concern for her well-being further reinforced Ananya's positive impression of Omar. In a country where she had been warned about various safety concerns for solo female travelers, Omar seemed like a protective and trustworthy ally. As their professional relationship developed, Omar began to introduce subtle elements of personal interest. He would ask about her life in Bangalore, her family, her career aspirations, and her experiences as a solo traveler. These conversations always remained respectful, but they created increasing personal intimacy alongside their intellectual connection. "I admire your courage in traveling alone to pursue your research," Omar said during one conversation. "Many people, especially women from traditional families, would never take such risks for their academic interests. You're inspiring in your dedication to your work and your independence." This validation was exactly what Ananya needed to hear. At home, her independence was often viewed as an obstacle to marriage and traditional feminine roles. Omar's appreciation for her ambition made her feel understood and valued in ways that were rare in her everyday life. Omar also shared carefully selected details about his own personal life, his struggles with family expectations, his romantic disappointments with women who didn't share his intellectual interests, his dreams of eventually pursuing formal education in architectural preservation. These confidences created a sense of mutual vulnerability and emotional intimacy. "It's rare to meet someone who understands both the technical aspects of architecture and the cultural significance of preservation work," Omar told Ananya one evening. "Most people I work with are either pure academics who lack practical experience or craftsmen who understand techniques but not the broader historical context. You bridge both worlds in a remarkable way." Such compliments were intoxicating for Ananya, who had spent years feeling like her interests were too specialized for most people to appreciate. Omar made her feel like her knowledge and passion were not just acceptable, but exceptional. This emotional manipulation was subtle but powerful, creating psychological dependency that would later make it difficult for her to recognize danger signs. By the end of her second week in Egypt, Ananya had come to view Omar as her closest friend in the country and her most valuable resource for authentic cultural experiences. She trusted his judgment about safe places to visit and worthwhile research opportunities. More importantly, she had begun to depend on him emotionally for validation, companionship, and a sense of belonging in an unfamiliar culture. As Ananya entered her third week in Egypt, Omar suggested they take a multi-day trip to less accessible archaeological sites in the region around Cairo. There are incredible examples of Coptic Christian architecture in some of the desert monasteries, he explained enthusiastically. These sites have architectural elements that bridge ancient Egyptian, Byzantine, and early Islamic traditions. For your research, they would provide examples of cultural synthesis that you won't find anywhere else in the world. The suggestion seemed like a natural progression of their collaboration. Omar had consistently provided valuable research opportunities, and his knowledge had proven accurate and insightful. The sites he mentioned were indeed significant from an architectural perspective, and Ananya knew that access to such specialized locations would greatly enhance her understanding of Egyptian architectural evolution. "I've arranged for us to stay at a guest house near St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula," Omar explained. "It's run by a Bedouin family who have been hosting researchers for generations. You'll be able to observe traditional desert architecture alongside the monastery's Byzantine and Islamic elements. Omar's plan was carefully constructed to seem both academically valuable and logistically reasonable. St. Catherine's Monastery was indeed a UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its architectural significance, and staying with local families was common practice for budget-conscious researchers. His description of the learning opportunities was compelling and aligned perfectly with Ananya's research interests. However, Omar had made crucial changes to the plan that Ananya wasn't aware of. The guest house he had arranged was actually an isolated building owned by one of his criminal associates, far from the monastery and from any other tourists. The Bedouin family was a fabrication designed to make the accommodation seem safe and culturally appropriate. Before departing, Omar suggested that Ananya inform her family that she would be out of cell phone range for several days while visiting remote desert sites. The research opportunities in these areas are incredible, he explained, but the infrastructure is limited. You might want to let your family know that you'll be offline for a few days, so they don't worry. This advice seemed reasonable and considerate. Omar had consistently shown concern for Ananya's safety and her family's peace of mind, so his suggestion to manage their expectations about communication seemed like thoughtful planning rather than a red flag. Ananya sent a detailed message to her parents, explaining that she would be visiting important archaeological sites in remote areas where internet and phone service were unreliable. "I'm going to some incredible places that most tourists never see," she wrote to her parents. "I'll be with Omar, who has been an amazing guide and cultural expert. I might not be able to call for a few days, but I'll update you as soon as I'm back in Cairo." She also posted a final Instagram update before leaving Cairo, featuring a photo of herself with Omar at a famous mosque, both looking excited about their upcoming research expedition. Heading off the beaten path for some serious architectural research. Sometimes the best discoveries happen far from tourist areas. The journey began normally enough. Omar had arranged for a comfortable vehicle and driver, and they spent the first few hours discussing the historical significance of the regions they would be visiting. Omar continued to demonstrate impressive knowledge about the architectural heritage of the areas they were passing through. As they traveled further from Cairo, however, Ananya began to notice that they seemed to be moving away from the main tourist routes and established archaeological sites. When she questioned this, Omar provided reasonable explanations about taking more direct routes and avoiding crowded tourist infrastructure. The most interesting examples of traditional architecture are often in places that haven't been commercialized for tourism, Omar explained. "If we want to see authentic building practices and meet craftsmen who still use traditional techniques, we need to go where the real work is happening." This explanation aligned with Ananya's desire for authentic cultural experiences rather than sanitized tourist attractions. She had specifically sought opportunities to see Egypt beyond the typical visitor experience, so Omar's approach seemed consistent with her stated goals. As evening approached and they still hadn't reached their supposed destination, Ananya began to feel genuinely concerned. The landscape had become increasingly desolate, with long stretches between settlements and little evidence of the tourist infrastructure she had expected near a UNESCO World Heritage Site. "I know this seems quite isolated," Omar said, noticing her discomfort, "but isolation is exactly what has preserved these architectural traditions. Tomorrow, you'll see building techniques that have remained unchanged for centuries, precisely because these communities have remained separate from modern development pressures." By the time they reached their actual destination, it was dark, and Ananya could see very little of the surrounding area. The building where Omar had arranged for them to stay was indeed isolated, with no other structures visible in the immediate vicinity. There was no cell phone signal, as Omar had predicted, and no internet connectivity. "The family is very traditional," Omar explained as they approached the building. "They don't speak much English, but they're honored to host a researcher who appreciates their cultural heritage. Tomorrow we'll be able to explore the architectural sites properly." Ananya felt increasingly uneasy about the situation, but she was now entirely dependent on Omar for transportation, communication, and navigation in an unfamiliar and isolated environment. She had no way to contact her family or friends, no independent means of transportation, and no clear understanding of her exact location. The trap that Omar had been carefully constructing for weeks had finally closed around her. The building where Omar had brought Ananya was nothing like the traditional Bedouin guest house he had described. It was a concrete structure that appeared to have been abandoned or hastily converted for temporary use. The interior was sparse and unwelcoming, with minimal furnishings and no signs of the cultural warmth Omar had promised. Most disturbing was the complete absence of the family that was supposed to be hosting them. "Where is everyone?" Ananya asked, her voice betraying her growing anxiety as they entered the empty building. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of wind across the desert landscape outside. Omar's demeanor had begun to change noticeably now that they were isolated, and Ananya had no means of escape or communication. The respectful, intellectual companion who had spent weeks earning her trust was gradually being replaced by someone colder and more controlling. "They're preparing for our stay," he said dismissively, his previous concern for her comfort notably absent. Desert people have different customs about hospitality. Ananya spent that first night in a state of increasing unease, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar and unsettling environment. The building felt more like a prison than a guest house, with heavy doors that seemed designed to keep people in rather than provide security. The isolation was complete. No lights visible in any direction, no sounds of human activity, no indication that civilization existed anywhere nearby. When morning came, there was still no sign of the promised host family, and Omar made no effort to explain their continued absence. Instead, he began to reveal more of his true personality, becoming increasingly demanding and controlling. The intellectual discussions that had characterized their relationship were replaced by orders and expectations that she comply with his plans without question. "We need to modify our research schedule," Omar announced over a breakfast of simple food that he had apparently prepared himself. "The sites I plan to show you require different preparation than I initially thought. We'll need to stay here longer than originally planned while I make the necessary arrangements." This was the first clear indication that Omar had been lying about their itinerary and that Ananya's research trip was not proceeding according to any legitimate plan. When she asked for specific details about what sites they would visit and when they would return to Cairo, Omar became evasive and increasingly hostile. "You wanted authentic cultural experiences," Omar said with a coldness that shocked Ananya. "Well, this is what authentic Egypt looks like. Not everything can be planned and scheduled according to your tourist expectations. If you want to see the real Egypt, you need to learn to be flexible and trust the people who know this country better than you do." The psychological manipulation that had been subtle during their weeks in Cairo became overt and aggressive in the isolation of the desert location. Omar began to undermine Ananya's confidence in her own judgment, suggesting that her concerns about their situation were evidence of her inexperience and cultural insensitivity rather than legitimate reasons for alarm. "I've been trying to give you opportunities that other researchers would kill for," Omar continued, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "But if you're going to act like a spoiled tourist who expects five-star accommodations and constant reassurance, maybe you're not as serious about your research as you claim to be." This accusation was particularly effective because it attacked Ananya's identity as a serious researcher and independent traveler. She had worked for years to prove her capability and dedication, and Omar's suggestion that she was behaving like a typical tourist struck at her deepest insecurities. Over the following days, Omar systematically isolated Ananya further from any possibility of escape or rescue. He controlled all access to transportation, claiming that the vehicle they had used was needed for other purposes and would return when their research was complete. He maintained that communication with the outside world was impossible due to the remote location, though Ananya began to suspect that he was actively preventing her from finding ways to contact her family. The promised architectural sites never materialized. Instead, Omar kept Ananya confined to the immediate area around the building, claiming that weather conditions, security concerns, or logistical problems made it impossible to proceed with their planned research activities. Each excuse seemed plausible on its own, but the pattern of delays made it clear that Omar had never intended to provide the educational experiences he had promised. As Ananya's situation deteriorated, Omar began to make increasingly inappropriate demands on her time and attention. He expected her to spend her days listening to his stories and opinions, to express gratitude for the opportunities he was providing, and to accept his control over every aspect of their daily routine. When she resisted or expressed dissatisfaction, he would become verbally aggressive and threatening. "You're completely dependent on me here," Omar reminded her during one confrontation. "There's no one else around for miles, No way for you to leave. No way for anyone to find you if something happened. I suggest you start showing some appreciation for everything I've done for you, instead of complaining." This explicit threat marked a turning point in Ananya's understanding of her situation. She realized that Omar had deliberately brought her to an isolated location where he could exercise complete control over her circumstances. The respectful cultural guide who had won her trust in Cairo had been an elaborate performance designed to get her into a position where she would be helpless and vulnerable. Meanwhile, in Bangalore, Ananya's parents were becoming increasingly worried about their daughter's prolonged silence. While they had expected her communication to be sporadic during her research trip to remote sites, it had now been over a week since her last message, far longer than she had indicated she would be out of contact. Priya Menon, Ananya's best friend since college, was the first to raise serious concerns. She had been following Ananya's Instagram posts throughout the trip and noticed that the final post from Cairo seemed different from her previous updates. While Ananya's earlier posts had been detailed and educational, focusing on architectural features and historical context, the last post was much more superficial and didn't include the kind of technical analysis that characterized her usual content. "Something doesn't feel right," Priya told Ananya's parents during a worried phone call. "That last Instagram post doesn't sound like Ananya at all. She never posts photos without detailed explanations about what she's seeing and learning, and she always responds to comments from followers, but she hasn't replied to anything in over a week." Priya's concerns were compounded by her attempts to research Omar El Sayed online. While his social media profiles seemed legitimate and professional, she couldn't find any independent verification of his credentials or reputation as a cultural guide. There were no reviews from previous clients, no mentions of his work in travel forums, and no evidence that he was associated with any established organizations. "I tried to find information about this Omar person," Priya reported to the Rao family. "His profiles look good, but there's no way to verify any of the information. For someone who claims to be a professional guide, there's surprisingly little evidence that he actually does this work legitimately." Rajesh and Kavitha Rao decided to contact the Indian embassy in Cairo to report their concern about their daughter's safety. The embassy staff were professional and sympathetic, but they explained that adult citizens had the right to travel independently, and that brief periods of communication gaps were not unusual for people visiting remote areas. "We understand your concern," the embassy representative explained, "but at this point, we don't have evidence of any crime or emergency. Your daughter is an adult who chose to travel independently, and she did inform you that she would be out of contact for several days. We can file a welfare check request, but unless there's evidence of foul play, our options are limited." However, the embassy did forward the Rao family's concerns to the appropriate Egyptian authorities, including the tourism police and the regular police force in Cairo. This led to Detective Salma Karouri of the Cairo police being assigned to conduct a preliminary investigation into Ananya's whereabouts and circumstances. Detective Karouri was an experienced investigator who specialized in cases involving foreign tourists and had handled several previous cases of missing visitors to Egypt. She was familiar with the various scams and criminal schemes that targeted solo travelers, particularly young women who might be vulnerable to manipulation by local criminals. Kauri's first step was to visit the guest house in Zamalek where Ananya had been staying. Fatma, the owner, confirmed that Ananya had left over a week earlier with a man she described as an Egyptian guide, but she hadn't seen or heard from her since then. Fatma provided a description of Omar that matched his social media photos, but she couldn't provide any additional information about his identity. The young woman seemed very excited about her research trip, Fatma told Detective Kauri. She talked a lot about visiting traditional building sites and meeting local craftsmen. The man seemed knowledgeable and professional, but I didn't ask for his credentials. I assumed she had done her own research about hiring a guide. Detective Kauri's investigation quickly revealed that Omar El Sayed was a false identity. There was no registered tour guide or cultural expert by that name working legally in Cairo. The social media profiles that had convinced Ananya of his legitimacy were sophisticated fakes, created using stolen photos and fabricated testimonials. Running facial recognition software on the photos that Ananya had posted with Omar, Detective Kauri was able to identify him as Omar Hassan, a man with multiple arrests for fraud, theft, and harassment of tourists. He was known to police as part of a criminal network that specialized in targeting solo female travelers, but he had always managed to avoid serious prosecution due to lack of evidence and witness cooperation. "This is a very dangerous individual," Detective Cowrie explained when she contacted Ananya's family with her findings. "He's been involved in several cases where young women have disappeared or been seriously harmed. We're treating this as a high-priority investigation and are mobilizing all available resources to locate your daughter." The investigation was further assisted by Yusuf Haddad, an investigative journalist in Cairo, who had been researching criminal networks targeting tourists for an upcoming exposé. Haddad had been tracking Omar Hassan's activities for months and had compiled extensive documentation of his methods and known associates. Omar Hassan is part of a sophisticated operation that preys on educated, independent women who are traveling alone, Haddad explained to Detective Cowrie. They target victims who are seeking authentic cultural experiences and who might be willing to trust local contacts for access to non-tourist locations. The victims are typically isolated in remote locations where they can be controlled and exploited. Haddad's research had identified several locations where Omar and his associates were known to operate, including the isolated building in the desert where Ananya was being held. However, reaching these locations required careful planning and coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies, as they were often in jurisdictions where local authorities might be corrupted or unwilling to cooperate. "Time is critical," Detective Cowrie stressed as she coordinated the rescue operation. "The longer victims remain in captivity, the more dangerous their situation becomes. We need to locate and reach your daughter as quickly as possible." As the investigation intensified, Detective Cowrie coordinated with Egyptian military and security forces to plan a rescue operation in the remote desert location where intelligence suggested Ananya was being held. The operation required careful planning due to the dangerous terrain, the possibility of armed resistance from Omar's criminal associates, and the need to ensure Ananya's safety during any confrontation. Yusuf Haddad's investigative work proved crucial in locating the specific building where Omar operated. Through months of research and interviews with survivors of previous attacks, Haddad had mapped the network of locations used by the criminal organization. His information allowed authorities to focus their search on a specific area rather than conducting a massive, time-consuming search of the entire desert region. Based on the pattern of previous cases and the information we have about Omar's current activities, Haddad explained to the rescue team, there are 3 possible locations where the victim might be held. 2 of them are easily accessible by road, but the third is much more isolated and would provide better security for the perpetrators. The rescue operation faced significant challenges due to the remote location and the need to approach without alerting Omar to their presence. If he realized that authorities were closing in, he might harm Ananya or attempt to move her to an even more remote location. The team had to balance speed with caution to maximize the chances of a successful rescue. Meanwhile, Ananya's situation had become increasingly desperate. Omar's behavior had become more erratic and threatening, as he apparently sensed that their isolation couldn't continue indefinitely. He had begun talking about the need to resolve the situation and had made increasingly explicit threats about what would happen if Ananya didn't cooperate with his demands. "You've caused me a lot of problems," Omar told Ananya during what would prove to be one of their final confrontations. "I went to a lot of trouble to arrange this experience for you, and you've been nothing but ungrateful and difficult. I'm starting to think that maybe you don't deserve to go home after all." These threats represented a significant escalation in the danger to Ananya's life. Omar's previous threats had focused on abandoning her in the desert or making her captivity more unpleasant, but he was now suggesting that he might harm her permanently. The psychological torture of the past weeks had apparently been building toward a violent conclusion. Ananya realized that her only chance of survival might be to attempt an escape, despite the overwhelming odds against success. She had observed Omar's routines during their time at the isolated location and had identified brief periods when she might be able to get outside the building without immediate detection. While the desert environment remained hostile and dangerous, staying with Omar seemed to guarantee harm, while escaping at least offered the possibility of rescue. On the morning when the rescue operation was approaching the building, Ananya made her escape attempt. She had noticed that Omar typically left the building early each morning to check the surrounding area, apparently looking for signs of approaching vehicles or other potential threats. During one of these brief absences, she managed to break out of the room where she had been confined and fled into the desert. Her timing was fortunate, as the rescue team was approaching the location at the same time. However, Ananya had no way of knowing that help was coming, and she was focused entirely on getting as far away from the building as possible before Omar discovered her absence. She ran toward what appeared to be higher ground, hoping to find a vantage point where she might be able to see signs of civilization or signal for help. Omar discovered her escape within minutes and began pursuing her across the desert terrain. He was better equipped for desert travel and knew the area much better than Ananya, giving him significant advantages in tracking her down. The chase that followed was terrifying for Ananya, who could hear Omar calling threats and promises of violent retribution as he closed the distance between them. "You stupid girl," Omar shouted as he pursued her. "Do you think you can survive out there alone? You'll die in this desert, and no one will ever find your body. Come back now, and maybe I won't kill you immediately." The rescue team heard the sounds of this confrontation as they approached the building and realized that the situation had become immediately critical. They abandoned their careful approach and moved quickly toward the sounds of the chase, hoping to reach Ananya before Omar could capture or harm her. The final confrontation occurred on a rocky outcrop where Ananya had tried to find shelter and hide from her pursuer. Omar had tracked her to this location and was threatening to throw her off the rocks when the rescue team arrived and surrounded the area. The intervention of armed law enforcement officers finally ended Ananya's nightmare and placed Omar Hassan under arrest. "It's over," Detective Cowrie told Ananya as medics began treating her for dehydration, malnutrition, and the psychological trauma of her ordeal. "You're safe now. We're going to get you medical care and then help you contact your family. Omar Hassan is in custody, and he won't be able to hurt you or anyone else." The rescue marked the end of a 3-week ordeal that had begun as a dream research trip and had become a nightmare of manipulation, captivity, and psychological torture. But for Ananya, the end of her physical captivity was just the beginning of a long process of recovery and healing from an experience that had fundamentally changed her understanding of the world and her place in it. 6 months after her rescue from the Egyptian desert, Ananya Rao was back in Bangalore, but she was not the same confident, adventurous young woman who had left for Cairo with dreams of archaeological research and solo travel adventures. The experience had left deep psychological scars that would take years of therapy and support to heal, and had fundamentally altered her relationship with travel, trust, and independence. The physical recovery had been relatively straightforward. Ananya had suffered from dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure during her captivity, but these conditions were treatable with proper medical care. The psychological recovery proved much more complex and ongoing. She struggled with severe anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress that affected every aspect of her daily life. "The hardest part," Ananya explained to her therapist during one of their sessions, "is that I can't trust my own judgment anymore. I thought I was smart and careful, but I was completely deceived by someone who was manipulating me from the first moment we met. How do I ever feel confident about my ability to read people or situations again?" Her relationship with her family had become closer but also more complicated. Rajesh and Kavitha Rao were grateful beyond words that their daughter was alive and safe, but they struggled with their own guilt about having supported her travel plans and their fear about her future independence. The balance between protecting her and supporting her recovery was delicate and constantly evolving. Ananya's career as an architect had continued, but her passion for travel and international research had been severely impacted. The firm where she worked had been understanding and supportive during her recovery, and she had been able to return to local projects that didn't require travel. However, the international opportunities that had once excited her now seemed threatening and overwhelming. Her friendship with Priya Menon had deepened through the crisis. Priya had been instrumental in raising concerns about Ananya's disappearance and had provided crucial support during her friend's recovery process. "Priya probably saved my life," Ananya often said. "If she hadn't noticed that something was wrong and pushed my parents to contact authorities, I might never have been found." Omar Hassan was ultimately convicted on multiple charges related to Ananya's kidnapping, as well as similar crimes against other victims. The investigation that followed his arrest revealed a pattern of targeting solo female travelers that had been ongoing for several years. At least 6 other women had been victimized by Omar and his associates, though many cases had never been reported due to the victims' shame, fear, or inability to navigate foreign legal systems. Detective Salma Cowrie had continued working on cases involving crimes against tourists and had become an advocate for better protection and support systems for solo travelers. The tourism industry has a responsibility to provide better education about the risks that travelers face, she argued in presentations to industry organizations. We can't prevent all crimes, but we can do much more to help people recognize and avoid dangerous situations. Youssef Haddad's investigative reporting on the criminal network that had targeted Ananya won several journalism awards and led to policy changes in how Egyptian authorities monitored and licensed tour guides. His work had exposed systematic corruption that had allowed criminals like Omar Hassan to operate with relative impunity for years. Ananya herself had become reluctantly involved in advocacy work aimed at improving safety for solo travelers, particularly young women. While she preferred to maintain her privacy, she recognized that her experience could help educate others about the sophisticated manipulation tactics used by criminals who target tourists. I don't want to scare people away from traveling, Ananya said during a rare public interview. Travel can be wonderful and educational and transformative in positive ways. But I want people to understand that criminals who target travelers are often much more sophisticated than we expect. They study us, they manipulate us psychologically, and they're very good at exploiting our desire for authentic experiences and meaningful connections. Her advice to solo travelers was practical but sobering. Verify everything independently. Don't rely on social media profiles or online testimonials to evaluate people's credibility. Tell multiple people exactly where you're going and who you're with. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate why. And remember that wanting authentic experiences shouldn't override basic safety precautions. 2 years after her ordeal, Ananya had begun to rebuild her confidence and independence gradually. She had taken several domestic trips within India, always with careful planning and multiple safety measures in place. She was considering the possibility of international travel again, but with much more extensive preparation and support systems than she had used for her trip to Egypt. I'm not the same person who boarded that flight to Cairo, Ananya reflected on the anniversary of her rescue. I've lost some of my innocence and spontaneity, and I'll always carry the psychological effects of what happened. But I'm still here, I'm still pursuing my career, and I'm still interested in the world beyond my immediate environment. Omar Hassan took 3 weeks of my life and caused trauma that will last much longer, but he didn't succeed in destroying me completely. Her story had become a cautionary tale shared in travel forums, solo travel groups, and safety education programs around the world. While the specifics were unique to her experience, the pattern of manipulation, isolation, and exploitation that she had endured was sadly common in crimes against solo travelers. Her survival and recovery offered hope to other victims, while serving as a stark reminder of the risks that can lurk behind even the most appealing travel opportunities. The dream of seeing the world and having authentic cultural experiences is beautiful and worth pursuing, Ananya concluded, but it has to be balanced with realistic understanding of the risks and careful attention to safety. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help other travelers pursue their dreams while avoiding the nightmare that I experienced.